Have you ever felt like the more you try to get close to someone, the more they pull away? Like you're walking on emotional eggshells, careful with every word, overthinking every text, wondering if you were too much or not enough. You're not crazy, and you're not alone. Chances are you're dealing with an avoidantly attached partner, someone who craves closeness but fears it the moment it starts to feel real. And here's the thing, no amount of proving your worth will ever make someone feel safe if they're not ready. But what if I told you that the shift you're craving doesn't come from chasing, fixing, or explaining, but from doing the exact opposite? What if the most powerful way to trigger an avoidant to lean in was to stop saying a single word? No games, no manipulation, just energy, boundaries, and presence that speaks louder than any speech ever could. I'm Jim Rohn, and I help people like you stop abandoning yourself in the name of connection and start owning the quiet confidence that makes you magnetic. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to flip the dynamic, not by changing them, but by reclaiming yourself. Because when you stop anxiously trying to earn love, that's when the right people start noticing your worth. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand what actually makes an avoidant want to chase, why pulling back with clarity creates more attraction than pleading ever will, and how to shift out of overperforming and into secure energy that draws people in without effort. And if you're ready to stop walking on eggshells, to stop confusing inconsistency with chemistry and finally start showing up as someone who chooses reciprocity, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't need to become colder to be respected. You just need to become clearer. Let's get into it. Let's be honest. If you're trying to make someone with an avoidant attachment style suddenly crave closeness, you're already fighting an uphill battle. These are individuals who, on a deep psychological level, associate intimacy with loss of freedom, identity, and most of all, control. The more you chase them, the more you confirm their internal story that connection means suffocation. And here's where most people get stuck. They believe that consistency, reassurance, and emotional openness will eventually break down those walls. But with avoidance, those same efforts often reinforce the very fears you're trying to soothe. You're trying to nurture, they're trying to breathe. The paradox is that the key to unlocking an avoidant's emotional curiosity isn't closeness, it's space. Not cold silence or passive aggression, but grounded, calm detachment. The kind of energy that says, I see you, but I don't need to convince you. I'm whole, with or without you. This isn't reverse psychology, it's self-respect in action. Avoidants aren't immune to longing. In fact, they often feel things more intensely than they let on. But the feelings are buried beneath layers of internal conflict. They're drawn to what feels safe, and unpredictability, when rooted in secure self-worth, creates a different kind of safety. It's not chaos they respond to, it's complexity. And that's where most people misunderstand the dynamic. You don't trigger an avoidant to chase by playing games or pretending you don't care. You do it by genuinely stepping out of the emotional loop where you are constantly managing their comfort at the expense of your own. When you become less readable, when your reactions aren't shaped by their push-pull patterns, when you stop handing over emotional power, they notice. Not because you're manipulating the outcome, but because you're no longer fitting into their default script. That interruption in the emotional rhythm makes them pause, wonder, reassess. And that's when curiosity kicks in. So if you're watching this because you're tired of feeling unseen, unchosen, or emotionally starved, start here. Stop narrating your worth to someone who only hears you when you fall silent. Let your distance speak, not from resentment, but from clarity. That's what stirs the avoidant to notice, when they realize your love isn't a guarantee. And ironically, that's what makes it feel real. Avoidantly attached people often grow up learning that closeness is complicated. It might have meant chaos, or guilt, or having to earn love by being perfect, pleasing, or invisible. So as adults, they protect themselves, not by rejecting connection, but by trying to control it. Control becomes their emotional safety net, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they once felt too much, too fast, without anyone helping them make sense of it. When someone always shows up, always forgives, always tries harder to close the gap, the avoidant doesn't consciously punish them. They just unconsciously register them as emotionally safe but psychologically dull. Predictability gives them control, and control reduces anxiety, but it also kills attraction. When someone feels fully accessible, the avoidant no longer has to stay emotionally alert, and so they quietly disengage. That's why the shift doesn't happen when you chase them. It happens when you stop being predictable, not by being erratic, but by being emotionally grounded. When you no longer react immediately, when you stop over-explaining yourself, when you don't fill the silence just to soothe your own discomfort, they feel it. At first, that distance might feel like relief, but eventually it unsettles something inside them because you're not playing by the script anymore. You've changed the rhythm, and they can't read you like they used to. And in that space of not knowing, their mind becomes active again. Why haven't you reached out? Are you moving on? Are you thinking about someone else? That emotional ambiguity, once avoided at all costs, becomes strangely magnetic. The pursuit doesn't look like a grand gesture. It's subtle. It's the random like on an old photo, the casual name drop in mutual conversations, the sudden reappearance after weeks of silence with a vague message like, "Hey, just thought of you." It's not always a full return, but it's an energetic shift. And here's the truth. They're not chasing you. They're chasing the feeling of unpredictability you now embody. The contrast, the shift from emotional over-availability to calm, self-assured presence. That's what unsettles their patterns. That's what cracks their defenses. You didn't manipulate them. You mirrored them. You stopped being the emotional caretaker and became the mirror they've spent their whole lives avoiding. And that is when they can no longer look away. When an avoidantly attached person sees their emotional patterns reflected back at them through someone who no longer bends to their rhythm, who no longer centers the connection around reassurance or pursuit, they begin to feel something unfamiliar, the fear of loss. Not a loss caused by drama or confrontation, but a quiet realization that the person they once felt in control of is no longer within their emotional reach. That's when the dynamic subtly shifts. The fantasy of control, something they've relied on to keep closeness manageable, starts to unravel. And as that illusion fades, something else takes its place. Attention, focus, even desire, because suddenly they're no longer the one holding all the emotional power. You're no longer emotionally available on demand. You're no longer soothing their fear of intimacy by absorbing all the emotional weight of the relationship. That silence, that unpredictability, it doesn't repel them, it pulls at them, not because you're withholding, but because you're grounded. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood, especially by those with more anxious or expressive tendencies. It can look like disinterest, coldness, even punishment. But true detachment, the kind that comes from self-awareness, not shut down, isn't about shutting off your feelings. It's about not letting someone else's avoidance hijack your internal state. And that kind of energy doesn't read as indifference. It reads as inner strength. And to an avoidant, strength without pressure feels safe. It doesn't flood them. It doesn't demand something they don't know how to give. It invites them to feel slowly, on their own terms. You see, avoidants aren't pushed away by feelings, they're pushed away by intensity they can't manage. When someone comes at them emotionally raw, seeking closeness like oxygen, their system gets overwhelmed. It reads as danger, not because they don't care, but because their body remembers what it felt like to care and be disappointed. So they intellectualize, they retreat. They do anything to escape the emotional storm. But when someone stands in front of them calm, clear, self-regulated, not cold, but emotionally steady, it disarms their defenses. It feels different. It feels safe. It's not chaos. It's not demand. It's stability. And from that stability comes something rare in the world of avoidant dynamics: respect, curiosity, and often, yes, longing. That's the hidden shift, not when they chase you out of panic, but when they begin to see you as someone they want to stay close to, not because they have to, but because it finally feels safe to try. Emotional detachment, when rooted in self-awareness rather than avoidance, sends a powerful message. My emotions are my responsibility, my boundaries are intact, and my worth is not negotiable. This isn't spoken in words, it's communicated through presence, through the energy you bring into the room, through what you no longer feel the need to explain. And while an avoidantly attached person might not be able to name this language, they understand it instinctively. They feel it in their nervous system. When you stop over-explaining your feelings, when you no longer rush to repair every moment of disconnection, when you can sit in discomfort without falling apart or demanding immediate reassurance, you're doing something rare. You're modeling what emotional regulation actually looks like, and whether they realize it or not, avoidants are deeply drawn to that kind of steadiness because it's something they don't yet know how to give themselves. What repels the avoidant is emotional urgency. What draws them in is emotional sovereignty. When you can express yourself without seeking to control the outcome, when you can be emotionally honest without expecting someone to rescue or fix it, when you can walk away from a moment without collapsing into self-doubt, you become emotionally safe in a way that is quietly magnetic, not needy, not performative, just solid. That's what catches their attention because it relieves the pressure they so often feel in relational dynamics. Emotional detachment in this light isn't a wall. It's a boundary that says, I care, but I'm not abandoning myself to prove it. This kind of calm presence has a subtle power. It doesn't chase, but it also doesn't punish. It doesn't overwhelm, but it also doesn't disappear. It holds space without overtaking it. And to the avoidant, this feels radically different from what they're used to. Suddenly, their fear of being consumed by someone else's emotional needs begins to fade because they're no longer being asked to manage someone else's experience. That space creates room for something they often don't expect, the desire to come closer on their own terms. What truly unsettles the avoidant, what disrupts their internal balance, is not anger, silence, or withdrawal. It's your self-regulated presence in the face of their distance. It's your ability to stay open without losing yourself. When they can no longer rely on your availability as a given, when you stop filling every emotional gap, they are left to face their own inner landscape. And in that unfamiliar silence, they start to feel the very things they've spent years avoiding: longing, regret, unspoken needs. Suddenly, your emotional availability is not assumed, it's earned. And that is when they begin, often quietly and hesitantly, to move toward what they thought they didn't need. When your emotional availability disappears, when you stop reaching out, stop over-explaining, stop trying to bridge the gap, something subtle but profound begins to happen inside the avoidant person. The balance they've relied on to feel emotionally safe starts to falter, not because you've done anything dramatic, but because your absence removes the external cues they once used to regulate their own defenses. They can't push you away if you're not there. They can't deflect, blame, or dismiss you if you're no longer emotionally present. And in that silence, one they may have once claimed to need, they begin to experience a discomfort they can't rationalize away, being left alone with themselves. Avoidants build their emotional world on control, independence, and distance, but those qualities often depend on someone else being close enough to resist. When you withdraw that emotional energy, not out of punishment, but out of self-respect, it removes the relational scaffolding they've been using to justify their detachment. Suddenly, they no longer have anyone to blame for the tension they feel. The restlessness they once projected onto you turns inward. And that's where the deeper truth starts to surface. They may not say it out loud, they may not even fully understand what's happening, but internally they begin to miss you, not just as a person, but as the mirror that once helped them avoid their own suppressed emotions. Your stillness becomes a trigger, not because it's cold, but because it forces them to feel what they've long avoided. They remember your presence in moments they least expect. You pop into their mind during the quiet, unguarded spaces. They scroll through your socials without engaging, replay old conversations in their head, and wonder what you're doing now that they're no longer the emotional center of your world. And that wondering, that's where the chase begins. Your emotional unavailability doesn't punish the avoidant. It exposes them, not by hurting them, but by removing the emotional cushion they've long used to avoid confronting themselves. That's the paradox at the heart of avoidant attachment. It's a system built to keep feelings at bay, yet it's entirely shaped by emotion. When the emotionally available partner, you, steps back, no longer chasing, no longer soothing, no longer broadcasting vulnerability for them to manage, it destabilizes their internal equilibrium. Without your presence as a buffer, they're left with the very thing they've spent so much energy avoiding, their own emotional landscape. What surfaces in that space isn't just discomfort, it's awakening. They begin to feel things they never let themselves feel before. Questions they never dared to ask rise to the surface, not because you've pushed, but because you've stopped pushing. Your silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror they start to recognize the emotional cost of their detachment. What they once dismissed as neediness or intensity now begins to look more like connection they've denied themselves. And in that realization, even if it's unconscious, something shifts. This isn't just about missing you, it's about finally noticing how much energy they've spent avoiding what matters. Mystery plays a powerful psychological role here, not as a game, but as an emotional gateway. Avoidants don't chase clarity, they're drawn to nuance. When someone is fully available, transparent, and emotionally readable, the avoidant nervous system sees it as pressure, even threat. It kicks up defenses. But mystery, ambiguity, those create space. Space to think, space to imagine, space to feel, without being asked to act on it. That space is crucial. Because avoidants don't resist emotion, they resist emotional demand. When you stop offering every answer, stop over-explaining, stop being constantly accessible, they no longer feel like they've figured you out. And that lack of closure is precisely what pulls them back in. They begin to wonder, not obsessively at first, but gently. Questions start to form in the silence. Why aren't you reaching out? What's changed? Are you over it? That wondering is where attraction is reborn, not because you've withheld affection, but because you've restored your emotional boundaries. Avoidants are wired to regulate distance, so when someone steps back without collapsing, it disrupts their internal map. Suddenly, the space isn't something they control, it's something they notice. And that noticing turns into curiosity. That curiosity opens the door to deeper feelings, and in their world, curiosity is one of the safest and most powerful ways they start to care again. Mystery, when rooted in self-respect rather than strategy, reintroduces something most avoidedly attached individuals don't even realize they're craving: challenge without threat. You see, for someone who has long equated emotional closeness with demands, and those demands with the loss of control, consistent availability can feel overwhelming, even if they genuinely care. But when you're no longer seeking validation, when you're emotionally grounded, when you begin to hold just a bit more of yourself back, not to manipulate, but because you genuinely no longer need to perform for connection, that shift pulls them in. You're no longer someone they have to brace themselves against. You become someone they can lean toward, slowly, on their own terms, without feeling emotionally suffocated. The unknown no longer feels like danger, it starts to feel like invitation. Without pressure, they begin to explore the very feelings they've buried, because they're finally doing it for themselves, not in response to your emotional needs. They might scroll through your old texts, click through photos they haven't looked at in months, replay past conversations in their head. And though they may not reach out, they feel the gap your absence creates. That curiosity, that quiet internal tension, begins to stir something deeper than logic. It touches longing, not the kind that panics and clings, but the kind that wonders, that asks, "Did I miss something important?" And here's the key: it only works when it's real. This kind of mystery isn't about withholding for power. It's about anchoring into your own worth so deeply that you no longer overshare or overreach to keep someone close. That authenticity is the magnet. When you stop advertising your availability, when you respect your own space, you naturally become more enigmatic. And that draws avoidance in. Not to possess you, but to understand you. To connect, perhaps for the first time, without the fear of losing themselves. This is why consistency without pursuit is one of the most emotionally disarming forces in the avoidant dynamic. Not chasing, not withdrawing, just holding your center. Most people dealing with avoidance swing between extremes, clinging too tightly or pulling away entirely. Neither creates true emotional safety, but showing up consistently without pressing in creates a space that feels safe and intriguing. It says, "I'm here, but I don't need you to complete me." And for someone used to equating love with pressure, that balance is quietly revolutionary. It builds trust. It keeps curiosity alive, and that curiosity is where real intimacy begins. Avoidantly attached individuals don't fear being alone nearly as much as they fear being emotionally engulfed. To them, intimacy often registers not as warmth or comfort, but as a threat to autonomy. The moment someone pushes too hard to close the emotional gap, asking too many questions, needing quick resolution, or seeking closeness with urgency, it doesn't feel like love. It feels like pressure. And pressure is exactly what they've spent a lifetime learning to escape. They don't interpret your pursuit as connection. They interpret it as a loss of control. But when you show up differently, when your energy is calm, your communication steady, your presence emotionally grounded without being invasive or demanding, you interrupt that pattern, and that interruption is everything. It shows the avoidant something they rarely experience, that connection doesn't have to cost them their independence. You're not asking for more than they can give. You're not forcing emotional intimacy on your timeline. You're simply present, regulated, reliable, and rooted in your own sense of self. That kind of emotional posture creates a subtle sense of psychological safety, and safety for the avoidant is the gateway to emotional curiosity. It's the first condition that makes deeper connection even possible. Consistency calms the nervous system. It signals that you're not reactive, not chaotic, not pushing them into a space they're not ready for. But the real shift happens in what you don't do. When you stop chasing, when you let them come toward you on their own terms, you give them back something they deeply value: freedom. Not the kind of freedom that comes from escape, but the freedom to approach without fear of being consumed. That kind of space invites them into a connection that feels voluntary, not coerced. And here's the twist: the more grounded and emotionally available you are without trying to get anything from them, the more they notice. They start to wonder, why aren't you reacting? Why aren't you chasing? Why doesn't your sense of worth wobble when they pull back? That wondering opens a door inside them. It disrupts the stories they've long told themselves about closeness and control. And that internal pause, that subtle, quiet curiosity, is where real transformation begins. Avoidantly attached individuals don't respond to what you say, they respond to what you consistently do. They track your patterns, not your promises. They pay attention to how you hold your boundaries under pressure, how you show up when they pull away, how steady you remain when things feel uncertain. When you stay centered, present but not intrusive, available but not self-abandoning, you're not just offering comfort, you're offering something much more rare: emotional safety without demand. That sends a deeper message than any emotional plea ever could. You're saying, I'm not here to fix you, chase you, or complete you. I'm here to meet you as a whole person. And that kind of presence is unfamiliar, maybe even unsettling at first, but deeply attractive to someone who's used to relationships feeling like pressure. What actually breaks through the avoidance defenses isn't force, it's self-worth. Not the kind you post about, not a performance of confidence, but a grounded, unshakable sense that says, I know who I am, and I don't need to lose myself to be loved. That kind of inner calm is what the avoidant nervous system notices. It doesn't feel like a threat, it feels like a choice. While manipulative tactics or emotional chasing only reinforce their belief that intimacy equals sacrifice, emotional stability interrupts that narrative. You're not pushing them to stay, you're not pleading for connection. You're simply being solid, whole, and unwilling to compromise your dignity for closeness. That's what they respond to, not because you've tricked them, but because for the first time, intimacy doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like something they might be allowed to want, something they can explore without losing themselves. When you hold your worth in the face of their retreat, you don't confirm their fears, you challenge them, gently, with presence. And in that challenge, something rare begins to happen. They become curious, not just about you, but about what it might be like to connect without fear. For someone with an avoidant attachment style who has spent much of their emotional life sidestepping closeness, there comes a moment when they see something they haven't seen before. Someone who can hold space for connection without falling into it, without clinging or collapsing under the weight of it. Someone who's emotionally steady, whole, and not looking for rescue or completion. And that moment, often subtle, often delayed, creates a shift. Because when you stop needing the avoidant to return your affection, when your sense of worth no longer hinges on their attention, when your dignity becomes non-negotiable, that's precisely when you become magnetic again. Not because you're punishing them, not because you're withdrawing to teach them a lesson, but because you've reclaimed your emotional sovereignty. And for someone whose attachment system is built on the fear of being swallowed, emotional sovereignty is the ultimate form of attraction. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that self-worth acts as a psychological mirror. When you're no longer over-accepting in the relationship, when you've stepped back without hostility and grounded yourself instead of chasing, they can no longer focus on your pursuit. They're left to face the emotional distance they created. And if there's any part of them that cares, and most avoidants do, it will start to rise, not through guilt or pressure, but through contrast. Your calm reveals their inner chaos. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your emotional wholeness begins to challenge their avoidance, not by confronting it, but by simply existing beside it. In the end, the most powerful influence isn't control, it's example. And the most attractive example you can offer is a life led by emotional maturity, unshakable self-respect, and quiet self-trust. That's not just what draws the avoidant's attention, it's what gently invites their transformation. Not because you ask them to change, but because they finally saw what it looks like when someone already has. As we wrap up, let's take a moment to anchor what really matters. The key to shifting the dynamic with an avoidant partner isn't found in chasing harder, explaining more, or shrinking yourself to fit their comfort zone. It's in coming home to yourself. It's in embodying emotional sovereignty, being open but not overexposed, grounded but not cold, connected but not dependent. When you hold steady in your worth and stop trying to earn love through effort, you stop feeding the fear-based patterns and start modeling what real safety looks like. You become the quiet invitation, not through pressure, but through presence. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope this video gave you deeper insight, not just into the avoidant mind, but into your own power to shift relational dynamics by standing in your truth. If this message resonated with you, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because we're not done growing together, and I'd love to hear your voice, so drop a comment below and share your experience. What stood out to you? What are you reclaiming in your relationships? Your story matters and your healing is valid. Until next time, remember, you don't have to chase love to be worthy of it. The right connection will meet you where you stand.